All right, hello everyone. My name is Camille Cowart, and I am an English teacher at Nashville School of the Arts in MNPS and a reading education master's student at Vanderbilt. Today, I am here with Gabby Griss, who is a recent Vanderbilt Secondary Education and Social Studies undergrad program graduate and current social studies and math teacher at Margaret Allen Middle School in Metro. I thought Gabby would be a perfect candidate for this podcast highlight because of her teaching situation. Margaret Allen has a high density of EL students, and as someone who hasn't taught math before, she's working to bring more elements of literacy into her math class to bring in her own strengths. So, hello Gabby.
Hello, thanks for letting me join you tonight.
Of course. So for this assignment, we read a few articles about multi-literacies in the classroom and the idea of multi-modally, so bringing in different technology elements, bringing in different types of text, which really applies well to your social studies situation especially. And you might have talked about that some in your social studies ed classes before, specifically in like human geo and stuff like that. So one of our articles was by a researcher named Leland, and it was talking about the idea of multiple ways of knowing. And it talks specifically about creating an inquiry-based curriculum that is really student-driven and interdisciplinary in nature. It also talks about the idea of sign systems, which means that students are looking for connections and bridges between topics so that they can conduct research about the topics themselves. So there's one quote in particular that really struck me that said, "The whole language movement taught language educators how to set up environments that supported children in thinking like readers and writers. Now, we need to extend these insights beyond language to sign systems. So, how can we set up classroom environments that support children in thinking like artists, like mathematicians, like dramatists, etc.?" So, after hearing this quote, do you think that this type of thinking is present in your classroom? And if it's not quite there yet, is it present in your planning?
I think that the extent to which this is present in my classroom is a reflection of the work my team and I does on an interdisciplinary level. If we're thinking about having students view the definition of text fluidly and interpret them through multiple disciplines and to think about them in an interdisciplinary lens. So I think about recently how my social studies class, we've been talking about the skill of cause and effect, which we're studying the American Revolution, and it's just a perfect historical event to look at cause and effect for. And my students weren't quite getting what the expectation was when asked to identify cause and effects. And so I knew that in their science classes, they'd been talking about Newton's laws of motion. So we brought up Newton's laws of motion and talked about how every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So we were trying to make connections between, in this case, science and social studies, thinking about how we can view cause and effect in both the way of the laws of nature and also in thinking about our classroom setting. So I think that's one sense, is to what extent are we as teachers tapped into and willing to reference other subjects and see our subjects as inherently more than just one content. I think with social studies, I've got a really great opportunity to be very interdisciplinary and very connective. But even with math too, which has, like you said, has been an interesting challenge. I think this year in general has just been about challenging my definition and my students' definition of a text. So I feel like in my program and in my preparation for my lesson plans, I had a very great sense of maybe some of the work that needed to be done preliminarily for a written passage. But often my text in social studies are maps or graphic organizers or images. And I think sometimes because these are great supportive tools, we often take for granted that students will also be able to consume that type of text. Right. But I think during my planning this year, I've had to think more critically about, for a different type of text, for these multiple ways of knowing a subject or representing relationships, how can we prepare students to enter in to these images or these graphs?
Right, and I know that you've talked a lot about whenever you've given certain homework assignments that weren't fluff homework assignments that were really supposed to be engaging and getting your students to think in different ways, especially when constructing their own images. Your students have been super resistant to that.
Yes.
And why do you think that is? What do you think that says about their past education?
That's a great question. And I also would like to say that when I saw, so I think the homework that you're referring to is a homework assignment that asks students to not only define a vocabulary word, a vocabulary of words that had also been pre-taught as a preference. They had to define them in their own words and also construct an image that represented that word. Not only have my students at Margaret Allen struggled with this, but additionally, when I had students at JT Moore in the 7th grade, they were also resistant to this same request for creation of a representation. And I think that a lot of my students associate artwork or drawing with a break from academic learning, or not as something that could inherently be academic or useful. Right. And so I think that helping to recognize how, images and these things, they aren't fluff, and getting them to think critically in that sense about how pictures can really be powerful representations is something that they haven't had before. They really do just think that coloring they don't see the value in it as much. And so I think that kind of shows that they're not asked to create in different ways as much, especially not independently. I think that teachers in our classrooms, we tend to do a really great job of trying to incorporate projects or opportunities in the classroom that are guided and structured, but that independent practice time and that independent creative time is something that requires a lot of build-up, and it's hard to have students feel comfortable to kind of fly on their own with that.
Yeah. I think that's something that I've even seen at an art school, where we have this idea of our kids are thinking typical students, I guess you could say, and I'm putting that in air quotes for all you listeners out there, typical students, but then they also do think like artists during the day in their own art form. However, for some of them, the moment that we bring that idea of bringing their art form into our content classroom, it's really difficult for them to marry those two things, to be like, okay, I'm in English class right now, and for this assignment I can keep thinking like a dancer, and I can keep doing all of that stuff. It's just interesting that those identities seem to be mutually exclusive in some of them. And in this class we've talked a lot about this from an elementary perspective, just because that's where a lot of the research is.
Yeah.
And something else I'd like to talk to you about is this idea of an inquiry-based curriculum. Whenever I think about this, and the way that it was presented in some of our texts really is that idea of, okay, a kindergartner sees a butterfly outside and gets super excited about it, and then their teachers really organically craft a lesson that is standards-based, but a lesson or a unit that follows their interest in this particular butterfly, like going into the science, going into art, going into stories about butterflies, all of that stuff, which is really great at a kindergarten and elementary level. But at the secondary level, that's something that perhaps I'm being too pessimistic about, but I certainly think it is a little bit more challenging for a variety of reasons. Do you find that it's challenging for you to try and follow your trains of thought from student interest?
Yes, I think that there's lots of expectations on the general education classroom in terms of the standards we're supposed to teach. And I'm in a situation with social studies in particular wherein I see my students every other day. And so there's not a lot of time to get a lot done. And so I think it's hard. There's such a desire to want to prioritize the beautiful moments of curiosity that can happen in the classroom. But in the moment, it's very difficult when you've got a rigorous box writing. So I have one student who is from Venezuela, a lovely student, and who has really been trying to engage in social studies class, but he passionately wants to learn about Venezuelan history. And with that type of description of history, I would love if my students could independently choose a topic and we could look at more of a skills-based history curriculum and explore historical topics from the lens of how can we apply our historical thinking skills to dive into this. I think that that's excellent. I think that exists as an enrichment opportunity in most cases rather than as the norm in secondary classrooms. So I think of projects like National History Day that exist where students can choose their own topics and develop projects. That serves the work of an inquiry-based curriculum, but it's not the curriculum, it's the exception. It's what we provide to students who we feel have achieved the baseline curriculum, which is hard. But I think that there are ways to bring in inquiry into the classroom still. it's hard, you got to get to know your students, and I think understand how you can thread those things throughout the year, but knowing if your students tend to tap in more toward even like relationships versus tapping into the, like, if they like reading like diary entries. So I think you can follow in line with student interest in just a more, not a less, in still an organic way, but less
fun. Well,
yeah,
it's still spontaneous,
but it's
less like whole overhaul, more day-to-day changes.
Yeah, it's more just like the way I present the content, the lens in which we talk about it is often shaped by what I know they respond to, but I can't change my standards based on the interest. But we do sometimes deviate from the norm. Like, for instance, my students have a really great desire to learn more about the news and current events, and so that's something that I've been trying to incorporate when possible into my classroom, and that's allowed us to make some positive connections. And I also try to forge a lot of connections with their own histories and their own experiences, which is not the same as inquiry-based, but I think that there's still that idea of providing connections to something that students are inherently curious about or have experienced that helps, because then students want to ask questions, and then it is like a buy-in, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, I know you have a lot to do, so I'm going to let you go, but thank you for talking with me.
Of course,
about
anytime.
this.